Ever find yourself wondering why we're so, obsessed with defining ourselves? Figuring out who we are, or where the power that actually shapes our identity comes from? Well, today we're going to tackle those exact questions by diving into one of the most important essays of the 20th century, Michel Foucault's The Subject and Power. Let's see what he has to say about who we are today.
So Foucault kicks things off with a question that honestly feels like it could have been written yesterday. He mentions this French newspaper writer who was just struck by how much everyone, everywhere, was suddenly talking about power. It was the topic on everyone's lips, this constant source of debate and anxiety. But why? That single question is the central puzzle he sets out to solve.
And then, right out of the gate, we get this huge plot twist. The man, who is probably the most famous thinker on power in the entire world, says, "Nope, my work isn't really about power at all." He says his real target, his main theme is the subject. He wants to figure out all the different ways that we, human beings, are made into subjects. So what's going on here? Why spend your whole career studying power if it's not actually your main interest? It's a real mystery.
To solve this mystery, we first have to get our heads around why Foucault thought we needed a totally new approach in the first place. He basically looked around and realized that the old ways of analyzing power, well, they just weren't working anymore.
You see, for the longest time, thinking about power meant focusing on things like the law or the state. You'd ask questions like, what makes a king a legitimate king? But Foucault saw that power in the modern world was operating in ways that were way more subtle, way more widespread, and these old frameworks just couldn't see it. He needed a new pair of glasses.
So, how do you go about studying something that's practically invisible? Well, Foucault comes up with this brilliant, kind of counterintuitive method. He argues that if you want to understand how power works, you don't look at the powerful people, not the kings or the presidents. No, you look at the people who are pushing back.
He has this amazing metaphor for it. He says resistance acts like a chemical catalyst. You pour it into a solution, and suddenly all these things that were invisible before become clear as day. That's what struggle and opposition do. They bring these hidden power relationships right to the surface, making them visible so you can actually study them. It's a genius move.
So Foucault takes his method and applies it to the big social movements of his day. Think feminism, the anti-psychiatry movement, and so on. And he starts to see a pattern. He notices these struggles are often international. They're not just limited to one country. And they tend to fight the power that's right there in front of them, the stuff that affects their day-to-day lives. But here's the most important clue. He realizes all these different struggles circle around the same core questions. They all challenge what it even means to be an individual, and they all, ultimately, are asking, who are we?
And this leads him to his first massive breakthrough. He realizes that, yeah, of course, people are still fighting against economic exploitation and political domination, but the defining struggle of our modern era is something else. It's a fight against what he calls subjection, a really specific kind of power that ties us to a particular identity that puts us in a box and tells us this is who you are.
And this right here, this is the absolute core of Foucault's entire argument. This new, modern kind of power doesn't just crush people or tell them no. It's actually productive. It creates things. It actively shapes and molds the very kind of people we become.
So the whole point of this power isn't just to control what you do, but to define who you are. It works to turn all of us into subjects. But Foucault is using that word subject in a very specific and incredibly clever way.
Okay, this is the heart of it. Foucault points out this brilliant double meaning hiding inside the word subject. On the one hand, to be a subject means you are subject to someone else's control. Like a subject of the queen. But on the other hand, it also means being tied to your own identity, being a subject of study, forced to understand yourself through labels like sane or insane, healthy or sick.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Foucault puts it perfectly himself. He says there are two meanings of the word subject. Subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by a conscience or self-knowledge. Both meanings suggest a form of power which subjugates and makes subject to. It's a power that gets us from the outside in and the inside out, all at the same time.
All right, so we've identified this really weird, modern kind of power that creates subjects. But where in the world did it come from? Like any good historian, Foucault starts digging, looking for its origins, and he traces it back to a place you would probably never expect.
He argues that the blueprint, the original model for this modern state power, is actually an ancient technique from Christian institutions. He calls it pastoral power. You know, like the power a pastor or a shepherd has over their flock. I know it sounds like a weird connection, but stick with me, because the way he lays it out is fascinating.
So, in its original Christian form, this pastoral power was all about one thing: getting people salvation in the next world. And the pastor had to be willing to sacrifice everything for his flock. But there are two features here that are absolutely key for Foucault's argument. First, it was deeply individualizing. It cared about each and every person. And second, to do that, it required knowing everything about them, their innermost thoughts, their deepest secrets.
Then Foucault says, around the 18th century, everything changes. This whole technique of caring for individuals, which had pretty much stayed inside the church for centuries, suddenly breaks out and spreads across society. The modern state basically hijacks this pastoral model and starts using it for its own very different purposes.
And you can really see the shift here. The goal is no longer salvation in the afterlife. It's well-being right here on Earth, things like health, security, and wealth. The agents of this power aren't just priests anymore, but this whole new army of experts, doctors, cops, teachers, psychiatrists. And the focus is no longer on saving an individual's soul, but on managing an entire population and categorizing every single person within it.
So here's the big takeaway. By inheriting this technique, the modern state creates what Foucault calls a political double bind. It's a kind of power that is, at the very same time, totalizing, meaning it looks after everyone, the whole population, and also deeply individualizing, meaning it tries to shape and define every single one of us. It's this bizarre combination that he says is completely new in history.
And that brings us to the end of our investigation. Foucault has followed all the clues, from modern-day resistance movements all the way back through history, to finally put the pieces of the puzzle together: power and the subject.
So now, finally, we can answer that question from the beginning. Why was Foucault, a guy who said his main interest was the subject, so completely obsessed with power? Well, it's because he realized that the modern subject, the way we even think of ourselves as individuals, was produced by this unique modern pastoral form of power. To understand the subject, he first had to invent a whole new way to understand the power that created it.
And Foucault leaves us with this final, really powerful challenge. If modern power works by pinning us down, by tying us to a specific identity and telling us who we are, then maybe real freedom isn't about some quest to discover our true, authentic self. Maybe, he suggests, the real political task today is to refuse the identities that are forced on us, and by refusing them, create totally new ways of being. It's a pretty provocative thought to end on. Thanks for tuning into this explainer.